Microtransactions are evil, and they are certainly not optional. I demonstrated as much in my video last week. This week, I'd like to talk less about the problem and more about the solution. What's up guys, Ace4Born here, and welcome to another video game discussion video. I do these analysis and discussion videos on a regular basis, so if you'd like to see more of them, hit that subscribe button to stay notified. Put simply, legal regulation is the only way to make these predatory microtransactions go away. Self-regulation won't work because corporations will only set self-regulations that are beneficial to themselves. Disclosure of in-app purchases before you buy the game won't suffice either, because as I demonstrated last week, you have no way of knowing what games will have microtransactions added to them in the future. Banning loot boxes and microtransactions is simply the only way. So that begs the question, how do we get our government to actually ban the microtransactions? Surely the AAA publishers will send lobbyists out the ass to Capitol Hill, who will do everything in their power to block any such bills from getting passed. We honestly can't trust Congress to act in our interests, because they will almost certainly act in the interests of the corporations who are paying for their power lunches. Well, guess what? At least here in the USA, we don't actually need Congress or the state legislatures to pass this law. Because believe it or not, despite the fact that the United States is a representative democracy rather than a direct democracy, there actually is a way that the individual voters can make our own laws, and the legislature, and by proxy the corporations and their lobbyists, don't get a say in the matter. That technicality that I propose we exploit is called the initiative. The initiative only exists for regular laws in 22 states as of the time of this writing. Most states allow initiatives for constitutional amendments, but right now we're concerned with regular laws, also known as statutes. I'll put a list on screen right now of the different states that have the initiative in it for regular laws. If you're in one of these 22 states, then the rest of this video is for you. So what exactly is the initiative? Well, for lack of a better term, it's when the voters, well, take the initiative and take the legislative process into their own hands. But how exactly do they do that? Well, if you're in one of the 22 states that allows regular laws to be passed via the initiative, you start by drafting the text of the legislation. This is the bill that will actually become law if the initiative gets passed. So you need to be careful about your terms. Make sure you close all the loopholes. I'll discuss in detail what to include in the anti-microtransactions bill later in the video. So once you've got a draft of the bill that is to your liking, your next step is to collect signatures for the bill. You'll have to collect a certain quota of signatures, usually a percentage anywhere from around 5 to 10% of the number of registered voters in your state. The exact number differs from state to state, so it's something you'll need to check into before the state will be obligated to accept your initiative petition. That kind of makes sense. After all, I mean, we can't just have any Tom, Dick, and Harry submitting whatever laws they want. That would just be a clusterfuck. In order for the state to be forced to accept your petition, you have to prove that your law has at least some modicum of popular support, right? So, assuming you get all the signatures you need, then you can submit your initiative to some office. Usually it's the state's Secretary of State, but again, it differs from state to state. If you've got all the signatures you need and you filled out the paperwork correctly, then your proposed law will appear on the next general election. That is, the first Tuesday of November on an even-numbered year. The voters can then vote on whether to ratify or reject the proposal. If a majority of voters vote to ratify the proposal, then it becomes law in your state and the legislature and governor get fuck all say in the matter. Neat, huh? Now I know what some of you were thinking. That sounds an awful lot like California's proposition system. And yes, California is one of the 22 states that allows voter initiatives. The bill that is submitted to the voters to be voted on to become law is called the proposition. but the entire process of collecting signatures and submitting it to the voters is called the initiative. California just does it more often than any other state. So, now that we have a plan, the first thing we need to do is draft the law that will ban the microtransactions. But what exactly do we include in this law? We don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater, after all. We don't want to ban ethical DLC, but the problem there is, how do we legally define ethical DLC so it isn't inadvertently covered by this law? We can say that ethical DLC is DLC that is reasonably priced and offers substantial extra content, like Dawn God or Far Harbor. But again, how do you legally define reasonably priced as well as substantial content? Historically, in a capitalist economy, courts have considered prices to be reasonable, proportionate to the content being purchased if consumers have, well, purchased the content. For hundreds of years, this supply versus demand balance has served our economy well. It's only thanks to the issues I discussed last time, where these purchases can no longer be considered optional or voluntary, that we are starting to have a problem. Okay, so we need to ban the microtransactions that aren't truly optional. Well, the problem there is, how do you prove that the microtransactions are not optional on a case-by-case basis? If we seek a refund because we were duped into the microtransaction, you can bet your bottom dollar that the game publishers will fight you at every turn, claiming that you actually did know what you were doing and only just now are you trying to get your money back so that you can essentially get free content. How do you prove that you were duped? No, in order to truly fix this problem, we have to ban microtransactions outright. There is simply no other way. So here is my proposal for this new law. Now, bear in mind that what I'm about to say is in layman's terms, not legal terms. In other words, you cannot simply copy and paste what I am about to say and use that for the initiative. I'll leave it up to your team of lawyers about how to translate everything I'm about to say into language that a court will understand and uphold. This is a YouTube video first and foremost, and therefore this video needs to be geared to a general audience. An attorney should be able to see this video and know how to translate it into legalese. Anyway, on with the terms. At the outset, we need to ban the sale of all video game content delivered via a digital download. There will be exceptions, of course, in order to protect the various ethical DLCs out there, but from the outset, any content that is delivered exclusively as a digital download is presumed banned unless it is covered by one of the upcoming exceptions. Now, this would not prohibit in-store purchases, such as amiibos. It would also not prohibit other content besides video game content that is delivered exclusively via a digital download or stream, such as movies, TV shows, or ebooks. It also would not include purchases that are made on a website but which are meant to be delivered to the consumer through means other than digital download, like buying a disc version of a game on Amazon.com or GameSpot.com, or by using a Steam key which you purchase off a website like CDKeys.com or G2A.com. In those cases, the Steam key may be delivered digitally, but it's not something you download. You may need to load the web page while you're logged into their account in order to get the key, but there's a difference between loading something and downloading it. Last but not least, because we are only banning the sale of digitally downloaded content, it would not include any content that is available for free, such as mods, post-release patches, or games that are already so old that publishers give them away just for good PR, kinda like how Bethesda gives away Arena and Daggerfall on their website for free. However, I highly recommend that you specify in your legal definition that this does include content in games that can be acquired via in-game currency if that in-game currency can be purchased using real money. It is highly recommended you specifically include that in your definition, because otherwise game publishers will fight tooth and nail to argue that such a system isn't covered by this law. Now, as for the exceptions to this law, The first major exception is for game content that can be fully experienced without any additional software purchases. This basically means that the whole games can still be sold on Steam. Now, some of you right now are probably thinking about game franchises like Dragon Age or Mass Effect, which allow you to import characters and even narrative choices from previous games in the franchise, and have those choices impact the story in the newer games. However, I believe this would also be covered by this exception, since the later games can still be fully experienced cover to cover without having to purchase and play the older games first. You may have to create your character from the ground up, and if you don't have any choices to import from older games, the plot in the newer games may not differ from the default plot, but you can still play the games fully even if you have no older save data to import. The next exception I recommend including is downloadable content that adds at least 1% of the game's initial data file size to the game's content, which need only be purchased once before it can be used and reused indefinitely, and gives no additional benefit to the same user who purchases it multiple times. Now let's break down everything I just said there. First, it has to be 1% of the game's initial data file size. So, if a game is 25 gigabytes in data file size, the downloadable content must add at least 250 megabytes of new data to the game's content. To qualify for this exception, it must actually add new data to the game's overall content. In other words, microtransactions that simply change a pre-existing value are not included because they effectively add nothing to the game's file size. The in-game currency counter is a value that presumably already existed in the game out of the box. Microtransactions that just give you in-game currency are simply changing the numerical value of that stat, not adding a new stat in the first instance. The same logic applies to microtransactions that merely unlock on-disk DLC. The DLC was already part of the game's file size, so the microtransaction isn't adding to the game's file size, it's merely changing just one value in the game's code, changing a binary value from locked to unlocked. Now, I trust that your legal advisors, once you're drafting the legalese version of this law, will be sure to include a definition that prohibits game publishers from just filling the DLC up with completely meaningless data that does nothing but take up space just so they can fulfill this data size quota. However, that will be your responsibility to close that loophole. I'm only bringing it up in order to put you on your guard so you know to close it. The third and final exception that I want to talk about today is cosmetic-only microtransactions that are not randomized in games that did not cost the end user any money to download and play to begin with. In other words, free-to-play games would be allowed to have cosmetic-only, non-random microtransactions. So, Fortnite fans, take heart, because your game will be safe. Of course, only free-to-play games would be covered by this exception. I also highly recommend that you acquire it to be cosmetic-only microtransactions instead of simply banning pay-to-win microtransactions. Because as Bethesda has recently demonstrated, the definition of pay-to-win is too easy to manipulate. The goal with this initiative law is to close out all the loopholes, so the stricter the definitions we use, the better. Now, this ban on microtransactions will most likely also include otherwise ethical mini DLC, such as most of the DLCs for The Elder Scrolls IV Oblivion. For the most part, those DLCs were considered pretty ethical. Sure, horse armor has become the stuff of legend, but then we have things like Wizard's Tower plugin, which was a fun little addition that didn't feel overpriced. Unfortunately, Shivering Isles is probably the only one of Oblivion's DLCs that would be large enough to fit the file size quota of being at least 1% of the original game's file size in order to pass. Unfortunately, that's what we've come to. Shady game companies like EA and Activision Blizzard had to go and ruin it for everyone. If it means getting rid of the unethical and even downright predatory microtransactions and loot boxes that are poisoning the video game industry today, then the mini DLCs from yesteryear that were totally ethical back in the day seems like a small price to pay. However, there is one aspect of this new law we're passing that I haven't discussed yet, but which we absolutely do need to discuss: the penalties for breaking it. After all, what good is it to make something illegal if there's no punishment attached to it? Republican U.S. Senator Josh Hawley has introduced a bill in Congress that would make it a finable offense to have loot boxes in your games. But if we're passing our own law using the initiative process, we can take it a few steps farther if we wanted, both to minimize the risk of this law getting broken, but also to send a powerful message to AAA publishers that we are fucking serious when we say that your microtransactions are unethical, whether you like it or not. Now, I would not recommend imposing a 20-year prison sentence for microtransactions. I mean, we need to respect the publisher's rights under the 8th Amendment. They have 8th Amendment rights, whether we like it or not. Imposing a 20-year sentence for a 99-cent purchase is nothing short of going overboard. No, I would recommend a minimum 30-day jail sentence and a maximum 90-day jail sentence. That gives the judge 60 days worth of wiggle room to consider various extenuating circumstances, and the sentence is reasonable compared to the crime being committed. The board of directors for the game publisher who has sold a microtransaction in your state would be the ones serving the time. However, if you think that microtransactions are the devil, and you think that the executives deserve to be in prison for several years because of them, there are loopholes we can exploit in order to get around that pesky 8th Amendment. For example, we could require each game sold where microtransactions are available constitutes a separate offense. So, if EA were to sell 500 copies of a game in your state, and that game had microtransactions in it, then their board of directors would be sentenced to 500 jail sentences, and each one of them has to be for at least 30 days. This means that the EA board of directors would be looking at a total cumulative sentence of at least 41 years and 8 months in the slammer. And that, ladies and gentlemen, is perfectly legal under the 8th Amendment to the US Constitution. Yeah, game publishers say their loot boxes aren't gambling because their content can't be redeemed for real-world value? Well, you're not the only ones who can exploit technicalities. Two can play at that game, motherfuckers! Oh, but we can take it a step further if we want. For those of you who really want to send a middle finger to AAA publishers, we can also include a provision stating that each microtransaction sale is also a violation of this law, in addition to the sale of the base game itself that has the microtransactions in them. So if a pair of kids inadvertently buy about 100 microtransactions and only get stopped from buying them because it turns out their parents' bank account was depleted, then that's 100 different violations of the law right there. You're looking at a minimum 8 years and 4 months in prison, and a maximum of 25 years in prison just on that one family's microtransactions alone. In order to ensure that these excessive jail sentences are actually imposed, we can forbid individual violations from being dismissed pursuant to a plea bargain. Now, that's not to say that plea bargains won't be allowed in these cases, but individual charges cannot be removed as a result of plea bargains. If a defendant is facing 100 different violations of this law, they can negotiate a plea bargain where they receive the minimum sentence of 30 days per violation, but they cannot, for example, plea bargain to plead guilty to one violation while the other 99 violations are dismissed. Also, you won't be allowed to negotiate in your plea bargain that you serve multiple sentences concurrently. This ensures that these harsh sentences will actually get handed down, and that 100 violations will actually result in a minimum of 8 years in jail. But what's that, you hear? We need an even bigger middle finger than that? Okay, we can also include a provision in this law saying that any members of the board of directors of any company may be subject to pretrial incarceration while they await their trials for these crimes, and also they are not allowed to post bail to be released prior to trial. Yeah, believe it or not, while the 8th Amendment to the US Constitution prohibits excessive bail, in an ironic loophole, there is no constitutional right to even have bail at all. So if a game publisher gets accused of breaking this law, they'll get dragged from their homes and driven over to another state in a police bus for about a 20-hour ride to wait for about 6 to 9 months in a dinky cell, not as punishment for their crime, but just to wait for the slow-ass court system to finally get around to hearing their case. They're still presumed innocent until proven guilty while they're sitting in jail. That would really discourage publishers from even attempting to cross the lines set by this law, even if they may ultimately get off on a technicality when they eventually do go to trial. But we can go even farther than that if we want. We can take our already elephant-sized middle fingers to the AAA game industry and crank them up so that they become absolutely colossal-sized middle fingers big enough to be seen from fucking Jupiter. Let's also include a provision that states that it is not a defense under this law if the publisher region-locked the game's microtransactions to ensure people in that state couldn't buy the microtransactions, but somebody managed to find a way to bypass the region lock and purchase the microtransactions on that state's soil any damn way. The board of directors for the game's publishers would still be guilty of breaking the law if that happened, even if the user bypassed the region lock with the explicit purpose of getting the company in legal hot water. Now, that last bit will probably be considered unconstitutional. I mean, it would just be egregiously unfair to punish somebody because somebody else broke the law, unless they were already in a relationship where vicarious accountability was part of said relationship, such as employer and employee or agent and client. And if you don't know what the hell I just said, don't worry, the attorney you hire to put this initiative law together will understand it. However, if that last provision gets declared unconstitutional, the AAA gaming industry will have, as the old adage goes, won the battle but lost the war. Everything else I just proposed will not be unconstitutional in the slightest, although some provisions may be more heavy on the technicalities and loopholes than other provisions. And even if this one provision doesn't survive a constitutional challenge, its tangible, concrete legal effect will not be nearly as important as the message it sends to the AAA gaming industry. And that message is, we aren't helpless. We aren't powerless to put up with your bullcrap. We can, and we will, pool our resources to protect ourselves if we feel it is necessary. We have the power to make our own laws, and we're not afraid to use it. So next time you introduce a mechanic in your games, and there is a public outcry about how unethical it is, maybe you should listen to your customers for once in your miserable life who call your business models unethical, instead of vigorously trying to defend your unethical business practices as ethical simply because you claim them to be ethical. Maybe next time, you'll remember to self-regulate so that we don't have to step in ourselves. I am not happy that it has come to this, but alas, it has come to this. I would much rather see the video game industry embrace responsibility and effectively self-regulate. But the simple bottom line is, they can't be trusted to do that. AAA publishers won't listen to reason, and that's all there is to it. You try to explain to them that loot boxes are gambling, and they'll come up with this or that purely superficial difference between gambling and loot boxes. You say that loot boxes are unethical, and they'll fight you and say that no, they're ethical, and so you're gonna have them in your game, and you're gonna like it. You refuse to buy a game that has microtransactions, and they'll counter by releasing a game that doesn't have them initially, lull you into a false sense of security, and then patch microtransactions into the game after you already bought it. The simple bottom line is that the video game industry simply will not listen to reason. The cha-ching sound effect that happens when you make a purchase speaks 1,000 times louder to them than the boo sound effect whenever people try to point out how unethical it is. And anytime you try to point out how the microtransactions are not truly optional, they will stick their fingers in their ears and go, la 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 la, it's ethical, la 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 la, shut up before we sabotage your YouTube channel with a dozen false copyright takedown claims, la 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 la. Legal regulation is simply the only solution to this problem. And thankfully, in nearly half the states in our country, we don't even need the government to do it. And with that, I bid you all adieu. Acer Thorn out. Peace!